George Bronson Scripture was born on July 12th, 1922 in Chittenango, New York. Chittenango. Boy, that's a good sounding name, isn't it? He was the second of 6 children born to Milton John Scripture and Amy Marie Corp Scripture. He spent his first 3 years in Saratoga Springs, New York, where his father was a pastor. In 1925, Milton moved his growing family to Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where the family stayed until George was in the 4th grade. Then the family moved again. You're going to hear a pattern here. Such is the life of a pastor, often moving every 4 or 5 years. Those moves can often be very difficult for the children. And George used to love to tell the story of how in 5th grade, shortly after the move to Newcastle in Titusville, Pennsylvania, he was struggling with adjustment because 3 older boys at the school didn't seem to like the new kid, and they started picking on him and making his life miserable. George had an older sister. Her name is Alice. Alice has a reputation. One day, Alice followed behind, out of sight, and sure enough, the 3 boys showed up, started pushing him around between the 3 of them, and Alice stepped out from behind a tree and soundly whipped all 3. She warned them never to pick on her little brother again. They didn't. It should come as no surprise that George and his older sister were always close from that day on. Of course, George could be a bit of a pest as well, and he often inserted himself into his older sister's life at the worst possible times, like when a beau would come calling. One time, when she was a little older, her father shoved everybody out of the living room, made them go outside and play so that she could talk with the boy that had come to call on her. George sneaked in and hid behind the couch with a little tablet and wrote down as much damaging information as he could. Well, when he made his presence known, his sister was not too happy with him. She grabbed him by the shoulders, looked him straight in the eye, and said if he breathed one word of what had happened, she would tell Dad a few things that he had done. He kept his mouth shut. When George was a freshman in high school, the family moved to Bradford, Pennsylvania, and he remained there until he graduated in 1932. Those of you that know George know even when he was in his 80s, he loved to sing. And he was actually a very accomplished singer and trumpet player, having the lead in musicals at school and upon graduation being offered a scholarship to Juilliard in New York. But George declined the opportunity because the Lord had already laid his hand upon this young man and called him into the ministry. And once he had his eyes set on that goal to which God had called him, he never turned away until he took his last breath on this earth, and then he got to finish that journey. After a year at Houghton College, he transferred to Nyack Missionary Training Institute in Nyack, New York. And it was there that he met and fell in love with Dulcie Elaine Wheeler. Now, those of you that know the Scripture family know that there are, I'm not sure I've kept track of all of them, I think about 8 or 9 Dulcies in the family. We have a granddaughter, Dulcie Elizabeth IV, so it's kind of working its way down. Well, both George and Dulcie graduated from Nyack in 1943, and George immediately began serving a church in Olean, New York. During the months that followed between graduation and the wedding, he hitchhiked back and forth between Olean and Bradford, Pennsylvania, where Dulcie was living. His sister Faith told me a story that in these trips in hitchhiking, one time he got picked up by a drunk. And he was so worried about riding with this guy that he told him that he was there where he wanted to be and to let him out. The guy couldn't figure it out because they were in the middle of a national forest. But when George got out of the car and it drove off in the distance, he only took about 6 steps before a big old bear came out of the woods in the road right in front of him. And he said he just froze. He said that bear stood up and sniffed the air a little bit, and he swears he looked in his direction. He thought, this is it, I'm a goner. And then the bear got back down on all fours and wandered off into the woods on the other side of the road. Do you know, I heard 4 stories of how God spared George's life. 4 different times when he could have died, God made sure that he didn't, because he was not done using him yet. On July 27th, in 1945, Shirley Rebecca, their first child, was born in Olean. She was followed by Dulcie Elizabeth on November 26, 1948, in Warsaw, New York, and then Jonathan Benjamin, who was born September 17, 1953, while the family was living in Laceyville, Pennsylvania. After Becky was born, George's beloved wife was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a rare disease that robbed her of her vitality and eventually claimed her life on September 15, 1957. The family was living in Tucson at the time, Tucson, Arizona, that is, not New York, where George was a pastor. Becky, Dulcie, and Ben went to live with their Aunt Alice in Clawson, Michigan in January of '58. Following Dulcie's death, George threw himself into finishing a college degree and went to work selling life insurance for a while. I can't figure out why he didn't stay in that. If he was as good at selling life insurance as he was at selling the gospel, he should have been a multimillionaire by now. But I guess, again, he knew that to which God had called him, and he did not turn away from it. He was serving a church during that time as well. He was extremely grateful for the support of his family, and his sister Alice cared for the 3 children for about a year and a half while he healed and continued his ministry. In 1958, George contracted pneumonia and was in pretty serious condition. When his sister Alice talked to her doctor and asked him to come and see her brother, who was at home, gravely ill. It wasn't a doctor that usually made house calls, but he did. He gave George some penicillin, and when George recovered enough to make a follow-up exam in the doctor's office, he met a nurse by the name of Ruth Bombauer. She took his temperature and his blood pressure. She knew who he was and his circumstances. And he turned to her as he was going out of the examining room, and he said, "I have 3 kids and I need a wife. Will you marry me?" She said, "I might take the kids, but I'm not sure about you." When she went out into the reception area, she told the secretary at the reception desk what had happened. And when he had dressed, he came out and asked Ruth how he might see her again. And the receptionist said, "When you get sick again." A week later, he invited her to church with him. He fell out of the car, by the way, when they got to the church, and then he tripped up the steps. So I'm sure Ruth was wondering a little bit about this fellow, but they started dating in the late summer, and around Christmas he gave her a ring. Ruth's mother fainted when he told her when she told her that he had 3 kids. She was about to become an instant mother. In 1959, he became the pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Detroit. With a position came a parsonage, and believe it or not, a housekeeper. It was an easy job. They didn't have any furniture. But the children remember Nora, a rather large lady with a huge heart to match. And the children all remember her with fondness. On June 6, 1959, George married Ruth, and the family settled into their new home.